my recording right now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. For those of you who are newcomers to ARIT Talks, I'm Zeynep Simavi, the Istanbul branch director of ARIT, and I am delighted to introduce you our speaker, Professor Gareth Winrow, and welcome him back to ARIT. Some of you may already know Gareth in person, as he previously lived and worked here in Istanbul for about 20 years. He was a professor of international relations at Istanbul Bilgi University, and currently he's based in the UK, teaching at Oxford University. So he's joining us from Oxford tonight. Gareth is a member of Chatham House, and he's also the recipient of 2 NATO Research Fellowships, along with a US Institute of Peace Fellowship. Though he's known for his books and articles on Turkish foreign policy and energy security issues, tonight he's going to give a talk on his most recent book, Whispers Across Continents, In Search of the Robinsons. In this book, by tracing the history of a single family, the Robinsons, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, he offers a gripping story of how the world events of these tumultuous times impacted the lives of the family members scattered around the world, spanning from the UK to India, Ottoman Empire, Republican Turkey, Europe, and the United States. Whispers Across Continents came out from the Amberley Publishing the year before in 2019. And actually back in November 29, we had the privilege of having Gareth at ARIT Istanbul for a book launch. So I am very delighted to welcome him back a second time for another talk on this fascinating book on the fascinating history of a truly remarkable family. I hope you'll enjoy the talk and also very much enjoy reading the book. So without further ado, I would like to give the mic to Gareth.
Great. Thank you very much, Zeynep, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me again to have another opportunity to talk to a broader audience about my book. This also gives me the opportunity to show some slides, which I hope will help illustrate what I'm talking about. And also, I've got some new information. The book is always still a work in progress. I'm still studying the family. So I have been able to tap into some new information since the book was published in 2019. Also, a big hello to members of the Robinson family who may be listening to this talk. I did invite several of them, especially also from the UK. So hello to you as well. Okay, what I'm going to do then is provide an overview of the book and then focus on 2 of the characters in the book, 2 arguably the main characters, Hannah Rhoda and one of her sons, who is well known in Turkey as Ahmed Robinson. And in doing that, I'm going to sort of deal with 2 themes, 2 issues. Firstly, there's a mythology which has developed around the family. The Robinsons are well known in Turkey, and indeed there is a sort of story or almost a myth which has developed about the family, which has been used by Turkish commentators and by Turkish officials. And I'll try and tease out this mythology and try and ask how this came about. How this mythology around the Robinsons came about, and partly that is due to Ahmed Robinson himself, as you will see. Also, within this mythology of the Robinsons, there's an important role played by William Henry Abdullah Quilliam, who is now quite well known in Turkey because of his links to Abdul Hamid, and I will discuss him as well. Secondly, I will try and discuss a little bit more about the US angle to the story, given the audience that we have here, because Ahmed Robinson spent almost half his life in the United States, and very little has been discussed about his life in America. Indeed, it's almost as if he didn't live in America. So towards the end, I'll try and talk a little bit more about Ahmed Robinson's life in America and reveal a bit more new information, which is not in the book itself. What is the book about then? It's a social and family history, a family history of the Robinson family. The Robinsons were originally from Lincolnshire in England, tenant farmers, quite wealthy tenant farmers. And I focus on one branch of the family, because they're scattered all over Lincolnshire. I focus on the branch of the family based on Spencer Robinson, who was originally a tenant farmer in the mid-19th century. And I look at him, his two wives, and the offspring, and take the story more or less up to the present day. And what I came across is fascinating information, facts literally stranger than fiction, dealing with stories literally across continents. There's political intrigue, there's suspected espionage. So it's a story which is quite action-packed and there's a lot in it. It's a family which is not well known in the UK and in the US, but which is quite well known now in Turkey because of the connections with Ahmed Robinson. So there, I would dispute there's been a recent review in Cornucopia, the magazine, on the last issue of Cornucopia, on the book by David Barchard, who unfortunately passed away very recently. And there he mentioned how I rescued the Robinson family from oblivion. I would question that, bearing in mind how well known the Robinsons are to some extent in Turkey. Why did I write the book? There's obviously a lot of interest in family history in the last few years, but this is not my family. It's the family of a good friend of mine, Ahmed Ceylan, from Turkey, now lives in Antalya, who is the great-great-grandson of Spencer Robinson. And hello to Ahmed, I think you're listening now. So I heard lots of stories about the Robinsons from Ahmed and from his mother, Gulperi Hanım. And from those stories, I became fascinated, wanted to learn more, and eventually decided to seriously work on the Robinson family. And the more I looked, the more sort of treasure I discovered. So it became a fascinating journey to study the Robinsons. And as I say, it's still a work in progress now. Now, this picture is slightly blurred because it's a copy of a photograph. And it's the only real photograph I've seen of Spencer Robinson. Or it's the only definite photo I know of Spencer Robinson. He's there, right in the right-hand corner. And this photograph was, I came across from an article in Turkish newspaper saying that this is in the library, in the desk, in the drawer, in the Galatasaray School's library. And the historian referring to the photograph is saying how this is Spencer Robinson and his family, and Ahmed Robinson is in the photo. So he was correct to that extent, but he identified some of the names somewhat wrong. What we have in the photo then, as I said, Spencer Robinson, right to the right, and to the left is his second wife, Hannah. She was born Hannah Rhoda. And then their children, and the smallest child, the baby, is Peel Harold Robinson, who would be Ahmed Robinson, become known as Ahmed Robinson. And the teenage boy in the middle, Minnick Robinson, he is the son, Spencer Robinson's son from his first marriage to his wife, Isabella, who died in her youth, and then Spencer remarried and married Hannah. And I can even date the year of this photograph. This was in 1889, looking at the ages of the children there. And this must have then been taken in India, because Spencer Robinson at that time was living and working in India. So there are other people in the family not included in that photo. There's another daughter of Spencer Robinson from his first marriage, May Bell, who's not in that photo. She was probably living in England at that time, and she would die in her youth in the 1890s, literally days before her wedding. That was a sort of family tragedy. She had an illness and died in the 1890s. And another person who's not in that photo is Gertrude Eisenmann, who became known as Gertrude Eisenmann. when she married Max Eisenmann. And she was the illegitimate daughter of Hannah and most probably Dr. Geoffrey Pearl. Hannah was, before she met Spencer Robinson, she was working as a housemaid in London and also in Sussex for Dr. Geoffrey Pearl in the 1870s. And Dr. Geoffrey Pearl was quite well known. He was a former mayor of Windsor, and he was one of Queen Victoria's personal doctors. And all the reports refer to him as a gentleman. But he was most probably the father of Gertrude Eisenmann. On the birth certificate, no father's name is mentioned, but in Dr. Geoffrey Pearl's will, he leaves lots of money to Gertrude. And Gertrude Eisenmann is a character in herself. I have a whole chapter on her life because she becomes famous in Germany as one of the first female motorcyclists, competitive motorcyclists, and then a car rally driver. And there's quite a lot of stories about her. She's a sort of cult figure in Germany today. So there's another member of the Robinson family, the broader Robinson family, who's quite famous. Why India? Why did Spencer Robinson go to India? He left England for India after the death of his first wife. And so he left in the mid-1870s. And in India, Spencer lived quite an active life until his death in 1889. So this photo is literally weeks, if not a few months before Spencer Robinson's death. He was the joint owner of various tea estates in the Darjeeling district. So he made use of his sort of farming practice, but this time translated it to the tea industry. He was also at various periods a traffic manager of the famous Darjeeling Himalayan Railway. He was also a wool trader. And he also, because of his knowledge of the area, provided logistical support for the British expedition in 1888 when they fought against the invading Tibetan forces. So Spencer Robinson himself I've got a whole chapter on India about his life. And for a period, he also spent a time in prison, in the Calcutta prison. He got into debt. So a very colorful life himself. This is Hannah Rhoda in her 70s. Who was Hannah? Who was Hannah Rhoda, the second wife of Spencer Robinson, the mother of Ahmed Robinson? She was born in Stepney in 1854 in London. Her father, Benjamin Rhoda, was a merchant seaman from Cornwall, and he died of tuberculosis at sea in 1856. So Hannah's father died while Hannah was an infant. Hannah's mother, Mary Ann Russell, was the daughter of a bricklayer from Bethnal Green. So we're talking of a family which is quite poor, a family which did spend time in the workhouse. Hannah herself, as a young child, it seems, spent some period of time with her mother in the workhouse. And then, as I said, in 1871, so when she was a 17-year-old, Hannah was then working as a housemaid for Dr. Pearl. Hannah married Spencer Robinson in London in 1880 and went to India. How Hannah was able to meet Spencer Robinson, how that actually took place, is still a mystery. Although I know that Spencer Robinson in the early 1870s did spend a period of time in Sussex, quite near to Dr. Geoffrey Pearl's summer house in Sussex. So they may have met there when she was a housemaid. In India, Hannah raised her family. She had several children, including Ahmed Robinson, and returned to England around 1890 after Spencer's death. By the time of the 1891 census in England, Hannah was living in Brighton, where she was running a superior boarding house on 6 Regency Square, Brighton, quite a prestigious location in Brighton. Shortly after that, she met whom she believed was a famous Afghan warlord who called himself Dr. Gulab Shah. And they quickly got engaged and then married. And Hannah converted to Islam, changed her name to Fatima or Fatma. Her children, her young children, also converted to Islam, not the illegitimate daughter Gertrude, and followed their mother to Constantinople, Istanbul, in 1891. The marriage took place at the mosque in Liverpool in 1891, shortly before, immediately then afterwards, they went to Istanbul. The marriage turned out to be a disaster. And I've been able to read letters that Hannah sent to the British Foreign Office, to the British Prime Minister's office, which are available in the National Archives at Kew Gardens in London. A couple of letters where she was appealing to the British authorities to rescue her, to help her, how she was trapped in a hotel in Istanbul, how this Dr. Gulab Shah was not an Afghan warlord, but was an imposter, an abuser of women, who married women for their money. He was really an Indian eye doctor called Ilihai Bosch. And the British authorities recognized this and said, yes, this guy has a track history of trying to marry women in England for their money. Hannah also wrote pleading letters to the Ottoman authorities to help her, to provide financial support, to help her get a divorce. She wrote a letter to the Grand Vizier. This is in the summer of 1892. And amazingly, she succeeded. She got a divorce through the courts. Sultan Abdul Hamid took a personal interest in the case of Hannah or Fatima and came to her help, basically. How was this possible? And here then, I think we need to bring into the picture Abdullah William Henry Abdullah Quilliam. There's a photo of him. Quilliam is quite famous in history, but his close connection to the Robinson family is not really well known. Quilliam was a lawyer based in Liverpool. He converted to Islam in the 1880s, and by 1889, set up arguably the first functioning mosque in England at Liverpool. He was a charismatic individual, a controversial individual, a very colourful character. And one can look at Quilliam's life in two different ways. One can look at his life with regard to the importance of the development of Islam in England, or one can also look more at his personal life, which is more controversial. The Robinsons played a role in both aspects of Quilliam's character. As far as religion is concerned then, Hannah, converting to Islam in 1891, having met the supposed Dr. Gulab Shah, was one of the first female converts to Islam in Victorian England. Not the first, but one of the first. And indeed, Quilliam may well have officiated in the marriage in the mosque in Liverpool. This was exactly at the time when Quilliam was trying to develop close relations with Sultan Abdul Hamid. And indeed, and to get financial support, recognition. And indeed, in 1894, Quilliam was appointed Sheikh al-Islam of Britain by the Sultan himself, the Sultan's personal representative in Britain. And as I briefly mentioned before, Quilliam is now, there's been a recent article in the Anadolu Agency on the life of Quilliam and his connections with Abdul Hamid. And this is partly due to the AK Party's and President Erdogan's increasing interest in the life of Abdul Hamid. And in that article, it mentions how Quilliam played such an important role, his charismatic oratory, helping to spread Islam in Victorian Britain. Hannah, in her pleading letter to the Grand Vizier, was clever enough to mention her personal links to Quilliam, and this obviously helped her. Hannah was known in the Ottoman Empire around that time then as Fatima Hanum of the converts, converted to Islam. The Sultan took a personal interest, as I said, probably partly because of her links with Quilliam, but also the fact that she had converted to Islam, gave her money, gave her accommodation, gave free schooling for her boys, and helped her secure a divorce, and arguably even provided her with a new husband, because after the divorce, within 2 or 3 years, Hannah had married one of the Sultan's rising military officers, Ahmed Bari. And some of the family stories say that it was the Sultan himself who personally introduced the couple. So there's Abdul Hamid, got to show his picture. And this individual also played an important role, Mustafa Ziki Pasha. Mustafa Ziki Pasha was one of the close confidants of the Sultan, Sultan Abdul Hamid. He was a field marshal. He was in charge of the imperial arsenal of ordnance and artillery, and he was also in charge of military schools. And he helped get 2 of Hannah's elder sons, Yaqub and Abdul Rahman, not Ahmed Robinson. Ahmed Robinson was too young at the time, initially anyway, to go to the Kulani military school, the prestigious military school in Istanbul. And Hannah's daughter, Maud, or Adile, was taken into the household of Mustafa Zeki Pasha to save her from Gulab Shah, who was trying to abuse her in the hotel, tried to sell her off to an Indian merchant to marry her off. So Mustafa Zeki Pasha took in the daughter of Hannah, Maud, into his personal household with his family. So the Quilliam himself, he visited Istanbul in May 1898, and Hannah, her husband, Ahmed Bari, the children were part of the official welcoming committee. This shows how high up Hannah had risen in Ottoman circles. They met together in the Para Palace Hotel. And then a few days later, when the Quilliam and his wife were seen off on the boat to go to Smyrna, it was Ahmed Bari's father, so the father-in-law of Hannah, Captain Mustafa Effendi, who presented Quilliam with a parting gift. So this shows the importance then of the Quilliam connection and Hannah's direct links to Quilliam. Now, as far as Quilliam's personal life is concerned, as I said, it was quite a controversial one. And again, the Robinsons seem to be connected. There is an argument made by Turkish commentators and historians that Quilliam was actually the father of Hannah's children, and that Ahmed Robinson's father then was Quilliam. And this is also being reported in the Ottoman archives, which refer to the death in the First World War of Yaqub, one of the sons, who was referred to in the Ottoman archives as the son of Abdullah Gavalian, Abdullah Quilliam. This is quite controversial because that Ottoman record referred to Yaqub as being a traitor, of betraying the Ottoman authorities in the desert in 1916 and giving intelligence to the British. This is unclear whether this was actually the case or not, but it's there on the Ottoman records. But as I said, the reference there to Yaqub being the son of Quilliam is wrong. Quilliam never went to India. Those children were definitely born in India. This is not to deny the fact that the possibility that Hannah may have had an affair with Quilliam, as Quilliam was quite known for his womanizing activities. The connection between the Quilliam and the Robinsons goes even further. Quilliam was involved in a notorious divorce case in 1908 in Liverpool, which led to Quilliam losing his job as a lawyer, Quilliam fleeing briefly to Istanbul, and the closing down of the mosque in Liverpool, all due to this scandal where the Quilliam was involved in a court case of Martha May Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, and she was trying to get a divorce, and Martha May Thompson's husband was set up with a prostitute in Glasgow, and it seems that Quilliam was involved in this incident. Whatever happened, he lost his job. But it seems that when Quilliam went to Istanbul in 1908, at the time of this scandal, Mrs. Thompson also went to Istanbul, possibly with Quilliam. And it is quite likely that Mrs. Thompson met the Robinsons, because I've also seen a letter in the National Archives in 1917 from Mrs. Thompson to the Foreign Office, saying she was extremely anxious to learn the whereabouts of her fiancé, Ahmed Robinson. She said how she knew the family well, how the family were well known at the Yildiz Palace. And she was very much concerned and was asking the British authorities, could you find out if Ahmed's still alive? So the information that she gave, the details that she gave, clearly showed that Martha May Thompson knew the Robinsons well. So maybe in 1908, at that time, maybe Quilliam told Martha May Thompson to stay with the Robinsons, since they were English, they could take her in for a while. And maybe she did get engaged briefly to Ahmed Robinson, or she thought she was engaged to Ahmed Robinson. The Foreign Office, surprisingly, never responded to Mrs. Thompson's letter. Hannah herself would enjoy a good life in the Ottoman Empire with her husband Ahmed Bari. They lived for a while rent-free, paying no rent in the prestigious Akaretlar quarter near the Dolmabahce Palace. The only other person who lived rent-free on Akaretlar at that time was Fausto Zanaro, the court painter of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Later, Hannah would move to Izmir, and she would die there in her old age, aged 93, and is evidently buried in Sultan Tepe near Üsküdar, although the family are not quite sure where her grave actually is. So that's the story of Hannah, but this myth has developed about the Robinsons, as I said. It may have been encouraged by the connections with Quilliam. The mythology about the Robinsons has even, as you can see, come to a children's comic strip book in Turkey. The lady in the picture is supposedly Hannah, or as she's referred to, Sarah, for some reason. And there's a picture of her there with her husband. And according to this comic strip book, which repeats a story in other books or mentioned in other books or mentioned by other Turkish commentators, Hannah is now called Sarah, or Lady Sarah, and she's supposedly well educated. She comes supposedly from a rich background. And the story goes that the Robinsons were in India, correct there, and that they converted to Islam whilst in India because of the plight of the Muslims that they saw in India, how the Indians were suffering. And Sarah and Spencer changed their names, and Spencer supposedly became known as Abdullah, and they emigrated to Istanbul. So according to this story, Spencer Robinson emigrates to Istanbul, doesn't die in India. And then the story goes into the stories of the sons, how they became famous, play footballers for Galatasaray, particularly Ahmed Robinson and his brother Abdul Rahman, and how they got involved, the two sons, in setting up the scouting movement in the Ottoman Empire. All those stories are correct, and how they would fight in the First World War. So it became a sort of adventure story, a feel-good story, a prestigious, educated British family converting to Islam and their sons fighting, serving the Ottoman Empire against their homeland in the First World War. So, like all myths, there's an element of truth in it, but only an element of truth. There's a lot of fabrication here, a lot of embellishments, a lot of inaccuracies, but it's a good propaganda story. It's a good story for the Turkish authorities or Ottoman authorities to show a prestigious family converting to Islam and the reasons why, and their sons, etc. How did this mythology develop? Ahmed Robinson himself, I think, is partly responsible, at least, for this. Here's a story in a Turkish journalist, Ahmed Robinson. I found Ahmed Robinson in New York. So you've got a photo of Ahmed Robinson there in the 1960s, and a photograph of the journalist meeting him. And this was at the Lyndhurst estate in Tarrytown in New York in 1964. And there, Ahmed Robinson tells a story about his life to the journalist, and tells her his family were a family which gave England prime ministers. The family were closely connected to the famous Sir Cecil Rhodes. Notice the similarity between Hannah Rhoda and Cecil, and the surname Rhodes. According to Ahmed Robinson in the story, his mother's family and his mother himself were famous in fields of art, education, and literature. All this is a fabrication. He said, though, that the family were well known at the Sultan's palace and were received there. That is probably correct. So Ahmed Robinson there, developing this sort of story, which maybe then other people picked up with and ran, other members of the family maybe, historians of Galatasaray, the football club. This is how that's the story, that mythology seems to have partly developed. What do we know about Ahmed Robinson himself? Well, there are a number of things that we do know, and there are two stories that, again, that have developed, emerged in Turkish history and even in Turkey today now, about Ahmed Robinson and who he was. First one portrays him in a very positive light. So there he is, goalkeeper for Galatasaray, standing in the white top with his arms crossed, in the Galatasaray championship winning team in 1908. So he was definitely a famous sportsman, one of the founders of the scouting movement in the Ottoman Empire, famous goalkeeper, arguably the best goalkeeper ever for Galatasaray. Won the title with Galatasaray 3 times before the First World War. Evidently, he had been in his partly as well at the Kulli Military School, but Hannah didn't want her children to become military officers, so they were transferred to the Galatasaray School. Later, Ahmed would become a sports teacher at Galatasaray School and at some other schools in Istanbul. And he was apparently a very popular teacher. He would organize field trips with his students. His students said up to half of his class he would just be telling stories, comic stories about sporting life in England and in the Ottoman Empire. He introduced basketball to the Ottoman Empire, played basketball. He popularized other sports in the late Ottoman Empire, field hockey, hockey on roller skates, tennis, rowing, volleyball. So he's become a sort of sporting legend, and rightly so, as far as his sporting exploits are concerned. With his brother Abdurrahman, he also did help introduce the first scout groups in the Ottoman Empire and the first girl guide groups in around 1911. Here is on the photo right at the back on the left-hand side with the white hat. And if you look closely in the photo as well, you will see a young Mustafa Kemal Ataturk on the middle row. This photo was taken in 1915, and this was a photo then of the so-called Ottoman Strength League. It was a group set up to strengthen the Ottoman youth to make them ready to fight in the First World War. And the scouting movement was co-opted into the Ottoman Strength League to help build strong physical youth, good youth to fight in the war. The scouting movement, like football actually as well, had first been regarded with suspicion by the Ottoman authorities. A scout's uniform looked a bit strange. They used an English handbook. The Ottoman authorities suspected if this was an attempt to promote Christianity in the Ottoman Empire. This all changed with the disastrous performance of the Ottoman Empire in the two Balkan Wars around 1912, when the Ottoman authorities realized that the youth needed to be fitter, physically stronger, to be able to fight properly, and the scouting movement then was seen as an important tool to rear up a strong, more physical, strong youth. And this fitted in at the time where the German military authorities were developing close links to the Ottoman Empire at that time. And there was this notion of nation in arms by one of the German generals, General van der Goltz. So this concept of having a strong nation in arms, ready for war. And the scouting movement would play an important role then within that. And this is not surprising. This happened in Britain as well. Under Baden-Powell, and the scouts played an important role in the First World War, reconnaissance, looking out, checking any possible attacks from sea or in the air. So the scouting movement was also co-opted in Britain as well. So it's no surprise that it was also the case in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, now the less positive view of Ahmed Robinson was that he wasn't a real Turk. He was even a spy for the British. And this resonates today in conspiracy theories and in the Turkish media. And I noticed in the Turkish media a few weeks ago, another article came up. It continually comes up, this article that linked with Kazım Karabakir, picked photo of him here, the commander of the Turkish nationalist forces in the Caucasus at the end of the First World War. There's a story which is in one of the volumes of his biography about how Ahmed Robinson wrote a letter in 1919 to his family in Istanbul saying, oh, there's this story that Istanbul could be partitioned, it may become an international city. And this correspondence was intercepted by the Ottoman authorities. And Kazım Karabakir was shown this letter and said, what's this? Are they spies? Is he a spy? Is his family been a spy all along? This is damaging to morale, this letter. We need to look into this, what's going on. So the military authorities were instructed to investigate Ahmed Robinson and who he really was. It's interesting, though, that there's no mention by Kazım Karabakir of Yaqub being a traitor and being executed by in 1916. So I'm not quite clear if Yaqub really was a traitor or not, if he's not mentioned by Kazım Karabakir at this time. Now, what's the backdrop to this? Ahmed Robinson was in the Caucasus at this time. He'd served in the First World War as a sledge instructor for the Ottoman Third Army on the Russian front, where his brother Abdurrahman died. And then after the war, he was an official translator, Ahmed Robinson, for the period of the government of the Southwest Caucasus. This was a government based in Kars of Turks in that area who were trying to set up a local government when the British were also in the area at the time. And Ahmed Robinson was the official translator and intermediary. He would deal with the government, the Kars-based government, and the British authorities. The British, I've seen in the National Archives, accuse Ahmed Robinson of being an Ottoman spy. And as we've seen, Kazım Karabekir has accused Ahmed Robinson of being a British spy. In this period, 1919, that's when Ahmed Robinson met his wife-to-be, Nina Jankowski, who seems to have been briefly a minister for post and telegraphs of the government of Southwest Caucasus. So you have this positive and negative stories of Ahmed Robinson, which keep being repeated in the Turkish press to today. What is clear is that Ahmed Robinson emigrated to the United States sometime around 1929. And it seems that he left disillusioned and frustrated. And it seems that he did have problems with the Turkish nationalist forces in the young Turkish Republic in the 1920s. What we do know is that after the war, having returned from the Caucasus, Ahmed Robinson would for a brief period be a PE teacher for the YMCA in Taksim, in the Beyoğlu branch. He was briefly president of the Galatasaray Sports Club in 1925. He played also a key role in the construction of the Taksim Stadium, photographed there, which is roughly based where Gezi Park is today in Istanbul. And the Taksim Stadium was opened in 1922. It was meant to be a grand opening, a sort of mini Olympics with athletes competing from many different countries. But at the last minute, all the Turkish sports clubs, apart from one, boycotted the gathering. Why was this? It seems that there were Turkish nationalists around at that time who were not happy that the preparatory talks for the opening of the Taksim Stadium had been held in the YMCA, a foreign Christian group, as it were, in Istanbul, because Ahmed Robinson had played a key role in the talks, in helping to get the construction of the Taksim Stadium and the organizing of the so-called mini Olympics. And so at the last minute, much to the dismay of Ahmed Robinson and others around him, there was a boycott of the opening meeting. So a number of athletes still took part. There was the British occupying forces, the French, Italian occupying forces in Istanbul at the time, who sent teams of athletes. There were Americans, Russians also participating, but only one Turkish sports club. And there were other frustrations for Ahmed Robinson in having to deal with hardline Turkish nationalists in the 1920s. Ahmed Robinson got involved with working with this individual, Asa Jennings, who was a senior representative for the YMCA in Turkey in the 1920s, and who was trying to set up the Turkish American Clubs Project, which was aimed to develop sports, cultural, educational ties with the Turks, with the Americans. And Ahmed Robinson played another important role again as a translator and also as an intermediary in meetings with Asa Jennings and with education ministers and other authorities in Turkey. And the aim was, first of all, to set up a sports social facility in Ankara, the new capital of Turkey in the mid-1920s. This project collapsed in the end, again, due to pressure from hardline Turkish nationalists who objected to the YMCA being involved in the funding of this project, again, a Christian organization. So they opposed the YMCA's direct involvement. Project was still funded by an American, by Arthur Nash, but the YMCA had to pull out. And Ahmed Robinson, again, was quite angry at this, disagreed with the Turkish officials he was translating and negotiating with. And at the time, there had been plans to set up a Turkish-American Friendship Association, in which Ahmed Robinson would have played quite a key role on one of the administrative committees. So all that collapsed in the mid-1920s. But unperturbed, Asa Jennings and Ahmed Robinson tried to work on a new project involving the YMCA, this time in Izmir, the reconstruction, rebuilding of Izmir after the destruction of Izmir, the Great Fire of Izmir in the 1920s. And between 1926 and 1928, Ahmed Robinson and Asa Jennings worked on the Smyrna Welfare Council project. This was a project to develop social welfare programs in Izmir. And it worked to some extent. The first modern sports field in Izmir was developed under this program. The first children's playground in Turkey was developed under this program. But again, it would collapse due to nationalist opposition, Turkish nationalists not wanting to fund it, not liking the YMCA's direct involvement, and not wanting the Smyrna Council to become an association, to become a more established organization. So again, that project would finally collapse. And again, Ahmed Robinson's work, Ahmed Robinson being very disillusioned at this. This is all before the American Friends of Turkey of the organization would be set up in Ankara in 1930. But by that time, Ahmed Robinson had gone. He had left around 1929 and emigrated to the United States. So the last bit now, I'll just briefly talk about Ahmed Robinson's life in America and then wrap up. We can trace Ahmed Robinson's life in the United States from census records, the American census of 1930, 1940, from Ahmed Robinson's World War II draft registration card of 1942, and from his naturalization certificate of 1956, when he became an American citizen. He was originally a seller of Oriental rugs, not in his repertoire really. So he would have had competition, serious competition from Armenians who'd been in America for some time, who had cornered the selling Oriental rugs in New York. So Ahmed Robinson lived as a lodger with his wife in downtown New York. We've even got in rented property. We've even got his address, 325 West 71st Street in 1930, 116 West 76th Street in 1940. So this is a bit of a come down from his life, mixing with top level officials, to living in rented property in New York with landlords and landladies who were supervising him. He didn't, Ahmed Robinson and Nina, I was able to look at correspondence, and they were good friends, for instance, with a couple, Myron and Edna Hess from Pennsylvania. And I tried to work out what's the connection here, because Myron Hess was a chemical engineer and they were in Pennsylvania. It's a different state from New York. I was really trying to work out, that they were sending postcards to one another. What was going on here? And then later I saw the obituary to Myron Hess, of Myron Hess when he died in the late 1950s. And it said how Myron Hess spent much of his free time with the Boy Scouts of America, for America. So clearly Ahmed Robinson maintained his scouting connections and love for scouting when he was in the United States. There's also stories that he managed gas stations in the New York area. I've not been able to find any evidence of that. But by the mid-1950s, he was definitely working here. This is the Lyndhurst Estate in Terrytown, New York State, by the Hudson River. And by the mid-1950s, certainly by the time Ahmed Robinson became an American citizen in 1956, he was a caretaker stroke butler of the Lyndhurst Estate. The Lyndhurst Estate is quite famous, Gothic architecture, as you can see, It was at one time in the 19th century the property of the financier stroke robber baron Jay Gould, who at one time, who was arguably the 9th richest man in American history. He was one who bought and sold railroads in the 19th century. And after Jay Gould's death in 1892, his daughter Helen inherited Lyndhurst. And Helen Gould is quite important because she had close links with the YMCA. She was a devout Christian, involved extensively in charitable work. She donated $150,000 for the construction of Gould Hall, which is now in today's Robert College in Istanbul. At the time in 1914, it was the American College for Girls. So Helen Gould, her name lives on in Istanbul with Gould Hall. She raised money for the YMCA and the YWCA. After Helen died, her younger sister in 1938, Anna Gould, took over the running of Lyndhurst. And this is a photo of Anna Gould. And it was at the time of Anna Gould that Ahmed Robinson was working as a caretaker at Lyndhurst. Anna was unlike Helen. She was an eccentric, she was a socialite. One of her husbands was a direct descendant of Talleyrand, Foreign Minister of France, under Napoleon. She died in 1961. It was she then who must have employed Ahmed Robinson to work on the Lyndhurst estate. And from what I've been able to gather, there was a relationship of sorts between Ahmed Robinson and Anna Gould. Maybe giving her books. So there was some sort of connection between them. And maybe Ahmed Robinson's early connections with the YMCA was a good reference for him to get employed at Lyndhurst. And that is certainly one of the things I'd like to still explore. Once we have this pandemic over, I'd love to go into the archives of Lyndhurst, which are nearby, and try and explore a bit more about Ahmed Robinson's life at Lyndhurst. And it's there at Lyndhurst that Ahmed Robinson gave his interview to the Turkish journalist in 1964. Why did he talk about his family being linked with Cecil Rhodes? Was this then some sort of revenge, taking revenge for this frustration, pent-up frustration, having to leave Turkey in the 1920s? That I'm still trying to grapple with and understand. And there are other stories that I've learned from Ahmed Robinson. Since the book was published, the doctor, who was a junior doctor of Ahmed Robinson at the time, his personal doctor, I've been in correspondence with. And his doctor, who was looking after Ahmed Robinson when he had problems with his lungs, he would die with that in the mid-1960s. His doctor told me how Ahmed Robinson told him stories that he came from a rich English family, that he had property, was very rich, and then with the taxes, the harsh tax regime after the war, he was forced to give up, lost all his money, and the only job he could then do was work as a butler. Literally moved from upstairs to downstairs. It was the only thing that he knew he could do. He didn't tell his doctor anything at all about his life in Turkey, his sporting achievements. He just told him how he'd been, evidently came from a rich English family. So that's fascinating. Why did he do that? Why did he report that? And there are other things as well about Ahmed Robinson. He kept changing his name. He did not call himself Peel Harold Robinson. He took the name when he was naturalized in 1956 of his brother, his older brother, Jacob, who was called Spencer, or Spencer John Bernard Robinson. He gave the birth date of his brother, 1884, not 1889, when he was born in Kalimpong in India. He said he was born in Kusiang in India, which was where his elder brother, Spencer John Bernard Robinson, was born. So why did he change his name? Why did he use another name of one of his brothers, not his original birth name? So another fascinating story, which has yet to be yet to work out. So he was clearly a complex, fascinating character who I believe could have achieved a lot more in his life if he hadn't left for the United States in 1929. So there's the cottage, the gingerbread cottage on the Lyndhurst estate. That's where I believed Ahmed Robinson lived, right by the Hudson River. Finally, there's a photo of Ahmed Robinson with Ahmed Ceylan and his brother Hakan, and with his mother Gulpari, the lady there. This is again 1964 on the Lyndhurst estate, and Gulpari was the granddaughter of Maud, Maud being the sister of Ahmed Robinson. And there's a family photo there in 1964. So to conclude then, my study of the Robinsons remains a work in progress. I'm still finding out new information all the time. I have been communicating with various members of the family. I've written pieces in the local Tarrytown Journal in New York, which enabled me to get contacts there. I've been telling the stories to people in Cornwall. I'll be giving a talk to Lincolnshire Family History Society next month. So I'm still trying to establish contact with other members of the family, learn other stories. So my work on the Robinsons remains a work in progress. I'm not finished with the Robinsons yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gareth, for this fascinating talk on this amazing family. I mean, you know, all the characters are very, very interesting, starting from, you know, Hannah to moving on to Ahmed and Gertrude, and all of them are kind of, you know, pioneers in their own ways, you know, the way that they have to, their lives get disrupted and they have to move from one country to another, but each time they kind of rebuild their lives and they kind of reimagine their identities as well. And it's also such a, you know, relevant and, you know, very, very relevant in our times as well, because, you know, all these changes of location, all these, you know, breaking away of families, it has always been happening in history, but this one is a very, very particularly important and a very interesting case, especially how a family can, you know, arrive to the Ottoman Empire without much, and then, you know, somehow make themselves known and establish these contacts, and then, you know, become these pioneering names for Turkish sports. So I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. Well, there are at least 2 comments. Leah Almond says, thank you. And Mohammed Al-Mirzan says, it's very good to join us here in this interesting lecture. Thank you. It's also so nice to have you as well. So anyone who has a question, you can either type it on the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask directly. So let's see. Maybe while everyone is thinking, I can ask you, oh, well, there's already, I think, one. Where in Lincolnshire did the family come from? Although now living in Northwest England with a husband working in Ankara, I grew up in Lincolnshire. When in Lincolnshire did the Robinson come from?
Okay, yes, I can answer that. I myself come from Northwest England, so I wonder where Beth lives in Northwest England now. The Robinsons, well, Spencer Robinson himself was born in East Keel, the village of East Keel. So the Robinsons were scattered around the villages around East Keel, that part of Lincolnshire. I did do field work there 2 or 3 years ago, went around the area, met the local historian, Kit Lowy, who has written several books on East Keel. So she was the person to take my wife and I around, and we talked with the farmers there, etc. So it's that part of Lincolnshire which is on the boundary between the Lincolnshire Wolds, the sort of hilly part of Lincolnshire, and the Fens. And the Robinson family had, their farms were scattered both on the Fens and on the Wolds. So that's where they came from, and there are other interesting members of the family there as well, and I will talk more about them when I address the Lincolnshire Family History Society, but certainly one of Spencer's brothers, Dr. Tom Robinson, was very famous. He became a Harley Street doctor and wrote several books, and was a socialite himself. He mixed with artists. He has a big art collection, pre-Raphaelites, and he was one of the Spencer Robinson's brothers. So the Robinsons are quite an interesting family, not just Spencer Robinson himself and his offshoots, but his brothers as well.
I think there's Çiğdem Balım who would like to comment. Çiğdem Hanım, if you would like to unmute yourself and comment, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Gareth. I don't know how many of you, probably a lot of you, have read the book. As much as the story of Ahmed Robinson is fascinating, what I found very, very interesting was the social and economic history of England, of Britain, and India. Incredible detail. I learned so much about India. I learned so much about the social history of Britain. So please do read the book, is all I can say. You didn't mention it, Gareth, but I think it's incredible research. Thank you.
Okay, on India, I did touch upon India briefly when I was referring to Spencer Robinson, but yes, there's a whole, I mean, I really enjoyed researching on that as well. And we did go to India. I did a field trip in India. I tried to trace where the footsteps of Spencer Robinson. So I was in Darjeeling, I was in Kalimpong, I went in to Gangtok, to Kurseong. So I got a flavor of that and went on a tea estate, went on the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway. And yes, I think there's still quite a lot more to be discovered there as well. It was only the last minute that I found out that Spencer Robinson actually spent time in the prison in Calcutta. He got into debts. He was running a bullock cart carrying company. Because he was there at the time when the railways were starting to develop. Before the railway system, goods and people would be moved very slowly on sort of rough roads carried by bullock carts. And he was involved in that as well. And one of the companies that he set up in Calcutta collapsed. And I also went to Calcutta, traced where he was there as well. So a very rich life. He was there in India just as it was modernizing, just as it was developing. He was making use of opportunities there. And what his son Minik, who was on that photograph, the teenager, he got him a job as an apprentice on the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway at the Tindhara locomotive workshop. So yes, the India side of the story is fascinating as well. And as you say, the English side, I tried in the book to contextualize it all the time. I tried to put it within the context of social, historical developments at the time and how the Robinson family was affected by those developments or not affected.
You have done that really well. Yes. Thank you.
Well, there is another question. This one is a linguist, just wondering if Hannah Robinson spoke modern Turkish or Ottoman Turkish.
Well, I know that from Ahmed Ceylan, who is in the crowd here somewhere, that there is a story about how she said once to her great-grandson, bir patates lütfen, one potato please. So I think she was, the whole thing, I think Hannah was very resourceful. And the fact that she was a survivor, that she was able to imagine being in a hotel, squashed hotel, being terrorized by this crazy guy who called himself Jack the Ripper in 1892. She didn't know the language at all. And she was able so quickly to establish ties. She said that she knew the wife of the Grand Vizier by June 1992. So she was a survivor, very adaptable, very resourceful. So I'm sure that she picked up Turkish quite quickly. When she was, I know that a story that when she was living in a car at Lar in 1907, she got this letter from the Minister of Finance saying, "You've not paid your money, you owe us some 90,000 kurush, pay up immediately." And she immediately replied saying, "No, this property is given to me by the Sultan," and the Minister of Finance personally apologized to her in another letter straight after that. So she was clearly, with it, a tough lady. She came from a very tough background. So I'm sure that she had linguistic skills as well.
And Ahmed Ceylan also commented, thanking you, Gareth, for all the hard work and for keeping up with the story. And to Arit, thank you, Ahmed. We are very, very pleased to.
And thank you, Ahmed, for introducing me to your family and for all the stories. And as I said, I think we can still find some more stories yet. But thanks.
And yes, Nicole Wanos, please do ask if you would like to pose yourself. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, thank you, Gareth, for a very interesting, story, or stories, actually, we should say. I still haven't bought your book or read your book, so I'm really now compelled to do so. You asked me at some point whether I had heard about Hannah during my work on Ottoman women and women in the late Ottoman Empire, early Republic, and I hadn't. But what were the names she went, which were used for her in, for example, correspondence, or if I would try to find her in the newspapers or women's periodicals? What name would she be mentioned? What were her names?
Yeah, I think she used several names. I mean, so in the letter which Mrs. Thompson wrote to the Foreign Office, she still said she's known to the British authorities there as Mrs. Robinson. That was in 1917, 1908, So she used the Robinson name still, but she was married to Ahmed Bari, and she has been either known as Fatima or Fatma Bari. And as I said, Fatma Hanum of the Converts was a term also used for her around 1892. I've a PhD student who was working on this sort of British women at that time. I picked up that story. I've not been able to get the where she directly got that from, but she insisted that she was called Fatima Hanum of the English convert of the Converts. So yeah, Robinson, Bari. She's got a calling card. Her calling card is even more confusing because she calls herself Fatima something Coffee. Now, where Coffee came from, K-O-V-I, I've absolutely no idea. So she had a calling card, and I've got a sort of copy of that. So yes, her name is her death is mentioned. I think it was in Cumhuriyet. I've got a source of it anyway in the book. But I think in her latter years, from the end of the First World War onwards, she really sort of fades into the background, and her sons, Ahmed Robinson in particular, get more publicity. But probably earlier on, you can track down some references to her, especially in the time when Sultan Abdulhamid was still in charge, up to the Young Turk Revolution. I think you'd probably find a little bit more about her then. So Robinson, Bari, yeah, I would love to try and find more information on her myself as well.
Okay, well, thank you. If I come across anything, I'll let you know.
Yes, let's work together. Yes.
Yes.
Well, if there are no other questions, or while everyone is thinking for more questions, I have actually one about his U.S. side of the story. I know that you're going to inquire more into that once hopefully the pandemic is over. But you said that he first did some dealing in Oriental rugs, and is that more like art dealing, like the Kevorkians and Kelekians, the Armenian art dealers did through Anatolia, or is it more like contemporary production of carpets that he was just selling as a, like a normal carpet store, or is it more like traditional art objects
the short answer to that is we don't know. But the address that he was living at that time was in the area were of the Oriental rug business, where those families that you mentioned, those Armenians were around. And interestingly, when Nina, his wife, I've got a record of her going to the US on the boat. And the address, I couldn't find Ahmed Robinson's record. And I've really looked at all the Ellis Island stuff. He must have gone there under another name. But his wife, Nina, gave as her first address in New York, the address of the textile building in New York, which had recently been built up, which was where all the Oriental rug merchants had their stalls. So that's the address that Nina gave, that she was going to in 1929, 1930. So in 1940, he's still registered as an Oriental rugs merchant. So he's doing that job for at least 10 years, but he's living in pretty small rented property. So I don't think he's making a big success out of it financially, from what I can gather. And probably there's very intense competition because those names, as you mentioned, were quite well known, and their families are still involved in the rug business today in New York. So I don't think he was as successful in the Oriental rug business as he was in sports, for instance.
No, that's very interesting, because in the 1920s, there's also a lot of interest on the art history side from the US and Turkey, like trying to establish an American institute, having the Byzantine Studies Institute by Thomas Whittemore. And I know Islamic art historians, especially Rudolf Riefstahl, was very much interested. He was teaching in Robert College in the early 1920s. And at the end of the 1920s, in 1929, they actually took Mehmet Ağoğlu to Detroit. So, and then there was all this, interest in Turkey and art history, and also, of course, a lot of art dealing too. So I was wondering whether I never came across when I was doing research in the museum archives, but I'll take a closer look, because the big names like Kevorkians, Kelekians, or Arthur Pumpob or Rudolf Riefstahl, who were also curators or scholars / dealers, they always pop up in the provenance of the objects, but I never came across for,
I read there was a blue book in the 1930s, a sort of list of Oriental rug merchants in New York, and he wasn't there. His name was not on that list. So, it doesn't seem like he was, that successful at that time.
Okay. And there are a few more thank yous. It was not a story, but were stories. I enjoyed going to this far in terms of place and time. And there were many others about thank you for sharing this amazing story, fantastic set of stories. Definitely, it's a very fascinating history of a family. So you were also saying, this is an ongoing process, and as you find more info, is it going to be another book, or how you envision on the fruits of this ongoing research, especially as you're present? I'm sure more and more people are reaching out to you with little pieces of information here or there, which help you connect the dots.
Well, I would like to develop the India side sometime. I've got a book review in Calcutta from one of the newspapers on the book. So if I can get more sort of interest in the Indian market, then maybe I could write an article or something on that. That's something I'm still thinking about. I did write an article for a journal with Chidem's journal, Anglo-Turkish Relations, on Ahmed Robinson. There is interest in Hannah. I have been contacted by some editors who are thinking of editing a book on famous British women in Islam, pioneering British women in Islam, and they're interested in Hannah's story. So if that takes off, I've yet to get more feedback from them. But there's certainly something there. And Gertrude Eisenmann really is quite an interesting story as well. The lady who became the racing driver in Germany. I've tried, I have contacts with her granddaughter in Germany and got some letters from her. and I have been in touch with people who were interested in that circle, sort of female motor racing drivers at that time. Her main competitor was Dorothy Levitt in Britain. And there's quite a lot of literature and books and articles being written on Dorothy Levitt. And I've been in touch with people who are writing that and saying, what about Gertrude as well? And so, I could get involved in some projects on that as well. So there's quite a lot of ways that the story could develop more. And maybe having talked to the Lincolnshire Family History Society in a month's time, maybe there'll be an interest there more on the Lincolnshire side, because as I said, there's quite a lot of interesting stories as well. For instance, another brother of Spencer fled to South Africa. He got into debt. He was a wealthy farmer, but he was called Peel as well. He got into debt and he ran away, and then his wife and children followed them, and he became a pub leader, running a pub in Volksrust on the Transvaal, and died there. So this sort of rags to riches and riches to rags stories, up and down social mobility, moving across continents. There are lots of stories which could still be further developed on that as well.
Well, we are very much looking forward to seeing the fruits of this, these coming out of this book, as you say, all these very interesting stories to, follow after. So I guess we don't, as before, I still say with even greater conviction, this has to be a film or a series.
Well, Chidem, I was waiting, Chidem, to give you to use your extensive contacts to get in touch with somebody on film or TV. Yeah, I agree.
I'm sorry about the spelling. I just noticed I'm still on Turkish.
That's all right. No, we got it. Perfect. No,
I will, Gareth. This is wonderful.
I'm waiting for that. Yeah.
Definitely, I totally agree that with a good screen, play, I think it will be totally and a very, very interesting, visual record as well, either in a
very photogenic, Darjeeling, railway,
definitely.
Istanbul, Constantinople.
Yeah. No, definitely. Hopefully that will also happen.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and also my heartfelt thanks to Gareth for taking the time to give us another talk on this fascinating book. And I really hope that this pandemic will be over very soon, so that you're, will be free to go to India and US and continue your research. And hopefully we'll have you again to hear more about the new research finds. And take good care, be safe everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.